We often talked about Northern Ireland having a world-class education system, and yet when you looked at our international performance, we weren't performing at the highest levels. Being able to deliver a coherent education system to enable all of our children to get the best possible opportunity in life, that is an opportunity for me as opposed to a pressure that I find overbearing. How do we tackle that attainment gap, that educational disadvantage? If you're not able to read, well then you're not going to be a good historian. You'll not be good at geography. To develop those kind of skills, the starting point is knowledge. Once you have really good in-depth knowledge, mastery of a subject, developing the confidence, you apply that to all of the skills.
Are you looking for brilliant CPD that is inspiring, illuminating and impactful? Well, Inner Drive's training is evidence-informed, engaging and makes a real difference. Whether it is in person at your training days or online through our Teachers CPD Academy, Inner Drive is transforming how schools and colleges do professional development. Email us at info@innerdrive.co.uk to take your staff training to the next level.
Hello and welcome to Inner Drive Science of Learning podcast with me, Bradley Bush. The podcast where we discuss the latest and indeed greatest cognitive science and educational studies. Because we believe there is gold in the research, and if we can make it accessible and put in front of the right people, i.e. you, our lovely listeners, it can be transformational in the lives of students. In this episode, I'm joined by Paul Givan, the Education Minister here in Northern Ireland, who is overseeing huge reforms, and the ripple effect of these reforms will be felt for years, if not decades. We are going to be discussing 3 influential pieces of work. When we uncover a key cognitive science principle, you will hear the principle ping. And when we discuss the nuance of application, you will hear the nuanced noise, which today sounds a bit like this. Paul, welcome to the pod. I thought this is a nice time to get you on the podcast because you're obviously 1 year into your Transformed movement and reforms. And I know you've looked at a lot of different things in that time. So like curriculum, assessment, teacher training. So I thought this might be just nice to look at some of the people that you've collaborated with, which I think are incredible, and look at some of their work and see how it may have influenced some of the decisions you guys are making. Does that sound okay?
Perfect. Happy to do that.
So one thing that has struck me, being partly involved with some of the changes going on over here, is just the incredible range of people that you do have either advising or working with you. People like Lucy Crean, Jennifer Buckingham, Daisy Christodoulou. Like, it really is an incredible group of people. And you had Daniel Willingham at your conference today.
Superb.
So yeah, let's jump straight in and talk about some of their work and what impact that's had. So I thought we'd start with Lucy Crean's book, Cleverlands. For me, I think this is my favourite book ever written in education. I just think it was so unique and fresh. So for anyone who hasn't come across it before, Lucy went and taught in and visited 5 different countries, Finland, Canada, Singapore, Shanghai and Japan, and basically reported on what she found and what we could learn from those places. Now, I want to start with a quote, if that's okay, from her book. It's actually at the end of her book, so we'll start at the end, just to kind of get your thoughts on it, if that's okay. So here's what she wrote. She wrote, this book was not written as a how-to guide for developing the perfect system, but I hope that by exploring the approaches and policies employed by some of the world's top-performing education systems, I've helped you come to a fuller understanding of what might work in your own. Now, given that Lucy's been very involved in the curriculum reform over here, I thought I'd just ask you kind of, did Cleverlands do that for you guys over here? And what really kind of stood out for you?
Well, when I came into the role as Education Minister, I had no time to prepare. I've listened to other previous ministers, Sir Nick Gibb, and he had opportunity when he was in the opposition as the spokesperson on education. I had none of that. I had basic knowledge as a local politician, sat in the school board of governors of 2 primary schools, a post-primary school, That never dealt with things like curriculum and assessment. It dealt with things like just recruiting teachers and employment practice. So it never any, I wouldn't even say in depth. I had very limited knowledge at all around the key aspects of education, with no time to prepare. And I only realised I was going to be education minister literally minutes before I officially took up office. My leader told me I was going to be a minister, but I didn't know what department until I was actually made education minister. So I didn't have the benefit that other ministers have had to do all of that preparatory work. And therefore, having to expose yourself very quickly to some writings of authors and what is it that makes a good education system. And Lucy's book was one of those books in those very early days where she talked about high performing countries and those countries that you've mentioned that she visited. And we often talked about Northern Ireland having a world-class education system. And yet when you looked at our international performance when it came to PISA and those measurements, we weren't performing at the highest levels internationally. And so yet, on the one hand, we would say Northern Ireland, great world-class education system, that actually didn't stand up to international measurements.
Yeah.
And so Lucy's book that you referenced, high performance countries, made me think about, well, what could we benefit from at an international level? What are they doing in Singapore? And reforms were taking place in New Zealand and Australia. There had been reforms in England, and how can we learn from them? Because whilst we've got great teachers, great school leaders, we've always got opportunity to do better. And let's look at what's happening in the rest of the world and see how that can feed into a Northern Ireland context. And so that's why Lucy's book was really important, to just demonstrating to me there is an outside world that we should be trying to learn from, and how can we harness that.
And that context of being kind of Northern Ireland specific, I find quite interesting, because one of the things I think that really comes through in Lucy's book is we can learn lessons from other places, but what we can't do is just take another country's system and just plonk it into ours. It kind of doesn't work like that. So I imagine the challenge is, for someone in your position, being able to learn from other places, but actually really filter what would work best in your own context and what probably wouldn't land as well. That must be quite an interesting challenge to try and work through that.
It is, and different cultural contexts, different values that countries and society even place upon the teacher. We're very fortunate in Northern Ireland where there's a very high level of respect for being a teacher. It's a really valued profession. And often people go into it, it is very much a calling, to serve wider society and help the next generation. And that comes through in the quality of the candidates trying to get into our initial teaching colleges. You need very high grades. There is a lot of demand for that, and that is give us a really good workforce. But you then need to have the right systems and structures to allow them and support them to use their talent to help young people. So learning from international best practice and then trying to blend that into a Northern Ireland context has been really important to this process. So we set up an international ministerial advisory panel, and we have people on it, not just from within the United Kingdom and learning from what happened in England and where did knowledge rich go wrong in England, and what lessons have we been able to learn from that as we've moved more towards a knowledge rich curriculum. But we have the former Chief Inspector in the Republic of Ireland, part of our panel. We have Dr. Jennifer Buckingham from Australia. We have Nina Hood, New Zealand.
I think Nina's amazing, by the way.
She's incredible.
I'm a big fan of Nina's work.
She calls it out in a very distinct way that New Zealanders can, in terms of trying to bring people along. But so we have been able to put international experts into this, and they have been able to help. But blended with that have been local experts and principals here in Northern Ireland and practitioners. And as we look at the reforms that we're implementing, whether it's on curriculum or assessment, the qualifications piece that we're carrying out, all of that is being merged between international best practice and local expertise, so that this is a Northern Ireland piece of transformation. It's made in Northern Ireland, it's for Northern Ireland, but it's being aided by international best practice. And so people like Stan Willingham, who I heard for the first time at a conference, where I had the privilege of meeting Edie Hirsch, That was the first time I was able to meet him in person and listen to what he talks about. And he's here in Northern Ireland this week.
Amazing.
And the school principals, I know, were really excited about coming to the events so that they could hear from people like Dan and Jennifer, but also to have that reassurance that there are Northern Ireland school leaders who are very much embedded in as part of this process of transformation.
Amazing. So before we get into the nuts and bolts of some of Lucy's suggestions that came from her book, I've got one more quote that I really just wanted to put to you, because I'm just really curious for someone in your position how much this resonates. So she also says in her book that education has the ability to nurture talent, inspire passions, increase social mobility, and provide a framework for adults of tomorrow to develop into knowledgeable, creative, and community-minded citizens. However, education systems are also just as capable of demotivating students and teachers, limiting their life chances of certain individuals, and amplifying pre-existing social inequality. So, given how much impact some of these reforms are going to have, it's a serious weight of responsibility. And so I was just curious for my own wondering, really, how much does that weight of responsibility kind of weigh heavily versus how much does it kind of motivate you, because it is such an opportunity to have such a positive impact if you get it right?
And there's a number of points to draw out of what you've quoted back in terms of Lucy's book around social mobility, and how that connects to a social justice and closing that attainment gap and those often from a more disadvantaged background, and how do we give them the best opportunity for social mobility. And that is something that weighs heavily on me, that often there is those who have the opportunity from their background of more privilege, and they get additional support, whether that's in the home or whether it's by purchasing in private tutors to aid so that they can be caught up on different aspects of the curriculum that they maybe haven't been fully able to grasp. So that social mobility is really important, and how we create those opportunities for people is what is driving me. It isn't necessarily, I don't regard it as a weight, it's a huge opportunity.
Right.
I've served previous ministers as their advisors in different departments. I was a minister in the Department for Communities, where we looked after things like housing and social welfare and local government. Sport was a part of that department. And then I was the first minister of Northern Ireland for a period of time when we were trying to navigate Brexit and all of the political turbulence that created, and the pressures and the tensions that were brought into our political system. So I've had the experience, even though politically I think I'm still relatively young, but I've been exposed to a lot of kind of pressured environments. And so therefore now, as I face these challenges, it is more that sense of responsibility of trying to make sure every child does get the best opportunity. That motivates me, as opposed to bearing down and not being able to cope with the pressure of that, and how I can deliver the best possible education system for them. So I think for me, it's an opportunity. We're financially, those pressures on the education system. Last year, we were running a £300 million deficit. This year, at this stage of the financial year, we're running upwards of a £600 million deficit. I have colleagues who've said to me, how are you sleeping at night knowing that financially we are in a very difficult position? And I says, well, that's a political problem. And we will navigate our way through the politics of all of that. But being able to deliver a coherent education system to enable all of our children to get the best possible opportunity in life, that is an opportunity for me, as opposed to a pressure that I find overbearing. But it is one that when I listen to a principal today, talking about all the pressures that they're dealing with and how they're committed to this reform program, I kind of felt that that's the onus on me as a minister to enable the people who make the real difference. And that has been part of my job, to support and enable the people who are really driving this transformation, and to be really clear-eyed and focused on saying, this is what we're going to do. We've discussed, is it knowledge, or is it skills, or is it both? And we'll maybe come on to that later as to how we've navigated that space. But having went through a process of internationally, what happens, how can we learn from that? what are we doing well in Northern Ireland, but through Lucy's independent review, where were the structural weaknesses? We've discussed all of that, we've debated it, and now through Transform Ed, we've decided this is what we have to do. 6 key fundamental pillars, a 10-point plan, and now it's about driving that forward. And I think one of the skill sets that any minister needs to have is recognising you have a limited window to be in office. You don't know how long that could be.
Yeah.
You need to drive the civil service and the system in order to achieve your objectives, because many people are happy to discuss and debate and go in a constant cycle without actually taking a decision and then moving forward into that real focused delivery implementation stage. And I think that's something that I bring. Great people around me, incredible civil servants that we've assembled in the department, and they're the experts working with our international advisors and our teaching profession. And my job is just to keep the main thing and not be distracted and buffeted by lots of different things that can take your attention away from trying to keep focused on all of it.
So if we're going to talk about keeping the main thing, towards the end of Lucy's book, she kind of reflects on kind of key principles that she's learned along the way. And she listed 5 principles of what she thought were of high performing systems. I thought if I tell you what the 5 that she listed were, I'm just curious to see from your perspective, which 1 or 2 kind of catches your eye that you think there's most room for improvement here, or has been a real driving focus for you guys as your main thing. So her 5 principles of high performing systems in the book were: 1, get children ready for formal learning; 2, design curricular concepts for mastery; 3, support children to take on challenges rather than making concessions; 4, treat teachers as professionals; and 5, combine school accountability with school support. Now, I'm sure you're probably going to say all 5 are really important, but out of those 5, was there any that kind of particularly has caught your focus and attention so far?
Well, like those 5 are encapsulated in Transform Ed in terms of the 10-point plan. You will be able to read directly across from those kind of 5 key principles, and you'll find them as the underpinning approaches in Transform Ed. And the 6 key areas of that transformation that we talked about earlier around curriculum assessment and tackling educational disadvantage. And so it's likely the third one is maybe the key one around, how do we tackle that attainment gap, that educational disadvantage? Do we say, that's as good as we can get them?
Yeah.
That our expectation is that they're at this level, they find it really hard, and if we can move them, if you have a scale of 1 to 20, and if that pupil is at number 2, well, if we can get them to number 3, that's likely as good as we can get. But another pupil, the same age in the same year group, they're maybe at level 5, and the expectation is, we could get them to 10. And there's this, I think, danger that we can have an inherent bias almost to say, well, a high achieving pupil, we can push them to do even more. But someone who's struggling, if we can just move them along a little bit, that's probably as good as it gets. So that principle of having really high expectations for every child, I think, is a really important one, because that will help address those who come from more disadvantage, and where we close that attainment gap, I think, are really important principles.
So that's a lovely segue into the second piece of work that I wanted to discuss, which was Jennifer Buckingham's literacy review, which is this comparative analysis, came out a few years ago, comparing like Northern Ireland, Ireland, Wales, Scotland, and England, looking at kind of what's going on in each of those places. And there's a lot to discuss in her review, but one of the things that stood out to me was she writes that the gender gap and the achievement gap in Northern Ireland was larger than elsewhere. I.e., basically, working class boys tend to do worse, and that very much speaks to that attainment gap that you were just speaking about. So I imagine when you read that must have really resonated.
Yeah, and the piece around literacy has been really important, and probably how I first got onto this journey, not just on literacy, but on the whole Transform Ed, came about from a school principal who at a different event talked to me and said, are you aware of the reading wars? Are you aware of the science of learning, the science of reading? And of course, no, I wasn't.
Yeah.
Because I was completely ignorant of any of these issues, because I'd never engaged on these matters around education.
Yeah.
I engaged on things like, let's get a new school for my constituency and campaign for improving physical infrastructure, not what went on in the classroom. And so she challenged me to come to her school and sit in a lesson. And that lesson was going through phonics and systematic phonics, and how you break down, and decode a word and the specific letters and how you bring that into a sentence. And I went back to the department and I said to my officials, you need to talk to me about the reading wars. And whenever we do, cat, ta, cat, why is this controversial?
Which is interesting, right? Because if an outsider would be surprised that there's this reading wars thing going on, because logically you go, well, that shouldn't be controversial, but historically it has been.
Correct.
Right.
And again, I wasn't aware of it in ignorance. And that's to my shame, by the way, as a politician. And we politicians should actually have a real interest in what's going on in the classroom and the most effective type of teaching. And but that principle, taught me through systematic phonics. And obviously, England introduced the phonics checks, New Zealand have introduced the phonic check, and Erica Stanford's driving all of the reform there. But that got me on to literacy. And we have been different types of, mixed methods, queuing, and we withdrew then our, what was called Count, Read and Succeed, which was a document going back quite a number of years, but was clearly out of date now with the evidence. And we started, that was the journey that whenever I said about some of these issues in education, and that's where my officials and my advisor was saying, well, actually, I've been doing a lot of reading on this, and there's real opportunity to do something significant in Northern Ireland. So literacy became an important one, because if you're not able to read, well, then you're not going to be a good historian. You'll not be good at geography. You'll not be good at any other subject.
It unlocks the whole curriculum.
That's correct.
Yeah.
So that is a key area. And it also is an enabler of greater equity and addressing things like, if the science tells us this is the best way that all children will learn, then that helps to close the gap between girls who often are better than boys. And we build that systematic approach to it, and you create a sequence of the basic fundamentals when it comes to reading, and you build upon that.
So building on that, that was one of the quotes that actually jumped out at me when I was reading Jennifer's review. So this was a quote by Dr. Geraldine McGuinness-Clark, talking specifically about reading in Northern Ireland. So she was quoted saying, the primary curriculum was very discovery orientated, particularly in regard to those aspects of the curriculum that do require systematic, direct, and in some cases intensive instruction, such as phonics. And that is really, I think, bang on for me, because reading is so different to everything else. Like, we will naturally learn to walk and talk just through osmosis and assimilation and just being around other people doing that. Whereas reading has so many odd rules to it that it isn't intuitive, and therefore it does have to be really broken down. And things like phonics and synthetic phonics can be key to unlocking that for everyone. Yeah. And
it's not that our schools weren't doing phonics. They are doing phonics. They have been doing phonics. Has it been structured literacy? Has it been direct instructional teaching led by the teacher? Not in every school. And so part of the new literacy framework that we've just published is to give a very clear framework for how literacy now is to be taught in every single school. And that will provide the framework for all of those schools to be able to follow, so that we get consistency of practice. And that's been part of the issue that I've been able to identify, where schools are doing different things. And that is borne out in terms of the academic attainment and progression of children because of that inconsistency of practice. And so we need to make it more consistent. And we've been, literacy has been part of that process in terms of the new framework. Numeracy is the next one that we're going to provide an approach to that. But when it comes to literacy, we will introduce a phonics check. It's part of our new assessment framework, because it is key to unlocking every other aspect of the education system in terms of those subjects.
So I'm looking forward to seeing the numeracy one, because if it's anything like the literacy one, and I'm not just saying this, I read a lot of these sort of reports and documents, I think your literacy framework that you recently released is incredible. I generally think it is one of the best documents I've read in terms of how it's structured and the rationale and the clarity. And I think it is a very impressive piece of work. That I think it's going to be a big success.
And we were able to bring in some people to do that. So, Geraldine McGuinness had been in one of her initial teaching training colleges,
right,
and so had already been actively, putting this forward within that one teaching training college. And so I said, well, there's a local expert. Let's bring her into the department, and we've been able to use her for a period of time, because that again shows local practitioners.
Yeah.
Here's a local expert that believes in this, and what's really impressive, once people are exposed to this way of doing things and they realise how it benefits the children in those early years, in terms of having the basic building blocks of what it is to be able to decode and break down words and sentences, that will enable someone to be very good at comprehension, which comes later in the education system. And so we had children maybe leaving, primary 1, primary 2 in those early years, and they could read, but they weren't able to build upon that in terms of more complex literacy, which comes later in the school age.
So it almost like masks the problem, because it's okay at the start, but it gets exposed later on. Yeah. Okay, so we've talked about Lucy's book, Cleverland, touched on Jennifer Buckingham's literacy review. Third and final piece of work that I would love to discuss with you is the book 7 Myths About Education by Daisy Christodoulou. So we had Daisy on, I think she was actually like the second episode of our podcast. I think might be one of the smartest people I've ever met in education. So her book, I think, is fantastic. Is this overview of like 7 common myths, but instead of just having straw man arguments, gave lots of examples and then broke down why they're myths and kind of suggested a better way of doing things. So just as I did with Lucy's book, I thought I'd start at the end of Daisy's before we kind of get into some of the details of what she covered. So this is one of her kind of, when she starts kind of concluding her thoughts on the book, but more indeed on education. And I just wonder, when I read it to you, how much kind of you identify with some of the stuff that she writes here. So she wrote, I agree that education should aim to produce confident, creative and problem-solving critical thinkers. I agree that we should prepare pupils for the 21st century. I agree that we should design our education system to suit everyone, not just the high achievers. I agree that education should be concerned with democracy and equality. I agree that pupils should be active learners and that lessons should be engaging. It is because I believe all of these things that I'm so concerned about the current education. The methods we are currently using to achieve these aims simply do not work. Now, she was obviously writing about 10 years ago in a different context, but I wondered, is that how you felt when you first kind of took post and when you were engaging with Daisy's work and her book?
Again, didn't seem an issue for me before I came into this role, our education system. I think the overwhelming majority of people in Northern Ireland and parents think that when they drop their child off at school, it's the same. They're getting the same opportunity. It's the same approach to pedagogy. It's the same curriculum. And that's actually not the case in terms of inconsistency of practice. And so, Daisy, when she talked about, her 7 myths, I thought did break it down very well. It did resonate with me in terms of, the ability for everybody to be able to access the curriculum effectively and to be able to acquire knowledge. And that is different based on circumstance and background. So yes, undoubtedly Daisy's work was impactful. I've had the opportunity to meet her. She's part of our international advisory panel and does exceptional work.
So I would love nothing more than to go through each of the 7 myths with you and discuss how relevant each one you think may or may not be for Northern Ireland. But I thought we'd just focus on just the first myth, if that's okay. So the first myth that she discusses is this idea that facts prevent understanding. And I know there's been more of a focus here now on developing a knowledge-rich curriculum. her kind of explanation of knowledge rich, she basically talks about how factual knowledge is not in opposition to creativity, problem solving and analysis, or indeed meaning and understanding. Factual knowledge is closely integrated with these important skills. It allows these skills to happen. And so I was just curious what you've seen from your perspective in terms of introducing this knowledge rich focus that you guys are going towards. How has it landed so far? Have there been any misconceptions or misunderstandings that you've encountered in having to explain to people who weren't perhaps like you, unaware of it beforehand, and now you're introducing kind of this concept? How's that kind of landed so far?
Well, a lot of our schools, would subscribe to, a knowledge rich approach to the curriculum. Our curriculum is some 20 years old though.
Mm-hmm.
And really, I think any country should be constantly updating a curriculum at least every 5-6 years. We haven't been able to do that. And the curriculum is vague. Right. And it speaks to kind of high level abstract areas to cover, but it lacks then specific content. And that leaves it open to a school to try and figure out what they should cover and what is the facts that need to be associated with the way in which the school is going to meet that abstract curriculum. So that becomes quite subjective, and that leads to the inconsistency of practice. So, when Daisy talks about, every child being able to acquire facts, she is correct in terms of you need that basic level of knowledge. And it's a bit like that saying, you need money to make money. You need knowledge to build upon knowledge, and you layer that on. And I think Edie Hirsch talks about, knowledge is like the Velcro.
Yeah.
You need to have something where it will stick to it, and then you build upon it. And so everyone needs to get the opportunity to acquire those fundamental facts, and whether it's in history or geography, and in order to give them the same opportunity. And a lot of people can have their knowledge expanded upon before they even come to school, because maybe in homes there's a particular interest in an area, and people will talk about it, as in my house. We would have sat around the dinner table, and there would have been a competition around name all the capitals, cities of Europe, or name all the counties in Ireland, and there was always just discussion and things that were informative. And so I was acquiring knowledge, from that home life, but not everybody gets that. So when they come to school, that is the level playing field. And therefore we can't just assume that every child is getting the same facts and knowledge outside of the school setting. And so we need to give that to them whenever they're in school. And they need to be able to acquire that basic level of knowledge, so that with that knowledge, they will get a deeper understanding of the subject. That then gives them, we seek to develop mastery. So you need to have more time to get in-depth understanding, rather than skimming through a very broad curriculum, and you can't get it into in any real sense of deep meaning. So less content, but deeper learning associated with that. Acquire that knowledge, and then you'll build upon it.
So I've got 2 questions to touch on in terms of this focus on knowledge. The first one being, so when I was over here about a year ago, I was talking to a primary school, and they were asking me about knowledge rich curriculum. And they said one of their fears was they were worried that some of their students didn't have the sort of prior knowledge that you were describing by the time they came to school. And so therefore those students would struggle the most because they didn't have the knowledge needed, they thought, for a knowledge-rich curriculum, which I thought was a real shame. It was a misunderstanding of what a knowledge-rich curriculum is. And in fact, if anything, that's the justification for a knowledge-rich curriculum it's this great leveler, essentially. It's not about, it doesn't privilege those who already have a lot of knowledge. It benefits everybody. And so it made me kind of just wonder, it's an interesting comms challenge, I think, when you're introducing this sort of stuff, because once you decide the route you go down, you also then have to communicate it really clearly. Because it's really easy for these kind of misconceptions or misunderstandings to kind of spread. So I just wondered how you guys found that from the department level. I know the conferences you put on help address that. But yeah, I guess your perspective on just helping make sure everyone knows that when you say, for example, knowledge rich, exactly what it means.
And in saying knowledge rich, and Daisy, I know, talks about this in terms of this debate around knowledge or skills, and it's not an either or. And
yes,
I think
it's like a false dichotomy.
She sums that up really well. In order to have really good skills like critical thinking, creativity, problem solving, you need to have an in-depth level of knowledge on the particular subject. And with that, then you have the confidence and you can then apply it in terms of critical thinking. So I think to have really good skills, and if you're trying to say, why do we do this for wider society, people that can be meaningfully employed, contribute to the economy, what does an employer, look for? Someone who's got skills, the ability to work in a team, and they're all really important. But to develop those kind of skills, the starting point is knowledge. Once you have really good in-depth knowledge, mastery of a subject, developing the confidence, you apply that to all of the skills, and then you get even better in being skillful.
Which is kind of my second question I was going to ask is, from your perspective, if someone was here and they wanted to ask, in fact, I was actually out of school and the principal said to me, this is the question he'd love to ask. In terms of vocational training, is knowledge rich kind of in conflict with vocational training, or can the two still go hand in hand?
Well, I think that, to me, it has to go hand in hand. But if you're looking at, in a globalized world and corporate businesses taking decisions as to where they're going to invest, where it's labor intensive, they'll go for the cheapest labor workforce, and that will drive them. If you're trying to get high end industries that are often very well paid, you need to be able to have a very highly educated workforce, and you need to have those skills. And therefore you need to have knowledge in order to create those skills. So I think today more than ever, in the day of AI and how we harness that, is going to be important. I think that actually speaks to the need for even more focus on knowledge and being able to determine, fact from fiction and what's fake news, and having critical thinking to be able to process information that's going to be generated through AI. So I think we really do need to have a strong focus on imparting good knowledge to every single pupil, and that will enable them to have better skills that can be utilised in a vocational setting in industry.
Paul, thank you so much, and thank you so much for your time. I said at the start of this pod that I genuinely think the changes you guys are introducing will have this ripple effect for like years, if not decades. And so it's just really lovely to be able to talk about some of the research and some of the books and reports that have influenced your thinking. And it'll be really interesting to maybe come back in a year's time and see how things are progressing. Paul, thank you so much for appearing on the pod.
Thank you.
For everyone listening, I hope you've enjoyed the episode. Please do get in touch, let us know what you think. Do like, comment, and above all, subscribe. Until the next episode, see you soon. Bye!
If you've enjoyed this episode and want to improve your staff's understanding of the science of learning, you'd simply love Inner Drive's training. We offer brilliant in-person workshops plus online support through the Teachers CPD Academy, trusted by thousands of teachers worldwide. Simply email us now at info@innerdrive.co.uk to take your staff's professional development to the next level.